of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So Steve King grew up in a law enforcement family in Storm Lake, Iowa. He attended Denison Community High School, where he met Marilyn Kelly, who he married in 1972. The Kings have lived in Kyron since 1976, and they have 3 grown sons and 8 grandchildren. King started King Construction in 1975 and built the business up from one bulldozer. He served in the Iowa Senate for 6 years and was first elected to the Congress in 2002. He believes the Constitution means what it says and that it should be read with the intent of the Founding Fathers in mind. King is never caught without a copy of the Constitution in his coat pocket, so please join me in welcoming 4th District Congressman Steve King.
Well, thank you, Colby, and there's a reason for that. I long carried a Constitution in my pocket all the time, but I could actually have been caught without one a couple of times until they wrote it in my bio. Now I'm never going to be caught without a Constitution in my jacket pocket, and that's part of the legacy that comes from that introduction, I think. But anyway, I do, and I reach in there and use it quite often, and I chaired the Constitution Committee up until we lost the majority here in the last Congress, and that was an endeavor that I thought I might get a different kind of an assignment, but when they handed me the gavel to chair the Constitution Committee, I thought, what can I do with this? Well, let's see. So I set about and wrote the heartbeat bill, and that was actually a pledge that I had made at the funeral of Phyllis Schlafly just a few months earlier, and used that committee to push that bill hard. And what that bill says is that before an abortionist can ply his trade, he must first check for the baby's heartbeat. If a heartbeat can be detected, the baby is protected. It's really that simple in philosophy, but it's very carefully drafted for a lot of legal reasons and Supreme Court precedent reasons. And we set up a whip team and started to get co-sponsors on that. Tom DeLay came back in from Texas, and pro bono on the House, helped us with that too. And we got up to about 162 co-sponsors, and it reached a plateau. And it's not really going very good now, because I wanted to get further with that. Then I thought, we got to put something on the scoreboard. So I called up your state senator here, Jason Schultz, and I said, Jason, do you think we can move a heartbeat bill through the Iowa legislature? And he gave a very detailed and informed and professional answer, which in summary came down to yes. And so we got together with that language, and I talked to Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Brad Zahn, and worked that language through. We put the last edits in it before it was filed in the state Senate last year. And I just had dinner last night with State Senator Amy Sinclair, who was the floor manager of the heartbeat bill here in Iowa. And it's kind of funny, but they brought that bill. It was very contentious, they all thought, and it passed the floor of the Iowa Senate in 24 minutes of debate. And I said, Amy, my first bill on the floor of the Senate took me 7.5 hours. And I thought they were kidding the first 3 hours, and then I realized, no, they were serious. So I complimented her on that again, and I'm really impressed with what we have for the representation we have here to the Iowa Senate and to the House. And when I look at the combination that you have with the 2 state senators, or 2 state representatives here, along with your state senator, that's the best combination, I think, in the whole state of Iowa. Maybe the best combination that I have seen ever represented anywhere, and I've seen some of this by now. So this is they're off at work doing things in Des Moines today. I'm talking good about them behind our back here in Charter Oak. That's what I wanted to let you know. I appreciate them. It's a great working relationship, professional and a friendship one. In most of our cases, it goes back before the time they were elected. I want to just touch a few topics in here, and we're going to take all of your questions and try to get them all answered at least. But some of the things I wanted to mention that are on the front of my mind, of course, is the flooding. And this is Thursday, and just a week ago, probably last night, it really started to reach the kind of peak that brought us to the flooding that we've seen. It's seen more water go down the Missouri River, but places like Hornick and Missouri Valley probably haven't seen more water. And what made this happen the way it was, of course, was all the ground was frozen, at least from here north and from here a little ways south. We had a lot of snow cover everywhere. We got a little better than a 2-inch rain. And when you melt snow that fast with that 2-inch rain, you put a garden hose out on the drifts in your lawn, you can kind of see what happened across all that landscape. and we had a lot of water coming down the Missouri River and being discharged out of Gavin's Point, but but a lot of that drainage we had is below Gavin's Point that was just roaring in throughout all the tributaries. But the Gavin's Point discharge was different. 2011, I represented the whole stretch, the western third of Iowa, and that was, of course, all the Missouri River and the Big Sioux. And we had, that discharge was up to 160,000 cubic feet per second coming out of Gavin's Point. That was about twice what they'd ever seen before. I remember them saying it was double what they had seen before. And and that water was up from about mid-June of 2011 till mid-September of 2011, and running over 680, which still is, I guess. But nonetheless, they peaked out at about 100,000 cubic feet per second coming out of Gavin's Point. They dialed this down, maybe by this morning it's 20,000. Would that be right, Colby?
Yep.
20,000. That's to make room for the Big Sioux River surge to come in, and then the channel of the Missouri is supposed to absorb that, so that the floods that we thought might be really bad down to places along by Akron and Hayward and up in that way aren't going to be maybe as bad as they had predicted a couple days ago. That's all kind of good news. Hornick and Missouri Valley, of course, been surrounded and evacuated, and it's a tough place for them. People at Hornick have lived through this before. I don't know the people in Missouri Valley have seen it as bad as they're seeing it now. And I'm heading over that way as when this meeting's over, and go back and touch bases there again with them. We're Iowans, and I'm always proud of our reaction to this. I've worked with the FEMA people for a long time, and I just think about, by the way, I made 4 trips down to Katrina in New Orleans. I was first member of Congress to go in down there. We broke some rules to go there, I'll just confess to that, and flew into the airport and just keyed the mic and asked permission to land. They gave it to us, so we went in. And I saw that from the air and from the ground, and went back and did what we could to help those folks down there. But here's what FEMA tells me. We go to a place like New Orleans, and everybody's looking around saying, who's going to help me, who's going to help me? We go to a place like Iowa, and we go see, knock on the door at say, make up a name, John's place, and say, John, if you got water in your basement, we can write you a check, we can help you. And John will say, well, wait a minute, let me get my boots. It's Joe that needs help. Let's go down to his place and help him. And they're just always gratified when they come and see how Iowans take care of each other. And so that's a point of pride that spreads across the country everywhere that I know. And another thing that should be and is on the front of our minds is, where is this trade negotiation going? When is this going to get opened up? And it was about a year ago when the trade negotiations became intense. Prior to that, I gotta say the NAFTA trade agreement was opened up. And I need to tell you, I would have never opened that up. It was good for Iowa agriculture, it was good for Iowa manufacturing, but it wasn't so good for some of the other areas in the country. And so when President Trump decided to open up the NAFTA negotiations, I didn't think either Mexico or Canada would be involved in that, but they did, and engaged in those negotiations. So I started to engage with our negotiators. And it's the first time I had to go into the SCIF, the secure room, to talk about trade, but they had trade secrets that could only be discussed in a secure room, so that means they're off-the-record classified information. But I will tell you from that, my judgment has been that the people doing the negotiations, they knew so much about all the nuances of the products and the trade negotiations that of all the questions I asked them, they'd anticipated every one, and they knew more about every topic than I did. And so I was pleased and impressed with that, and we've been working that along the way. And you know that they've reached at least a formal, I'll say a handshake agreement that's been announced, that it will be called, and is called, the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Since Canada came on board last, they got the initial in there towards the end, is how I think that went. Excuse me, I'm hearing from our pork processors and our retailers, and they're saying that the pork that if we need to get this approved and signed off on, that exporting hams into Mexico is costing us $10 a ham until we get this agreement done. And I wanted to get the agreement done, the USMCA agreement done, before we had to hand over the gavel to Nancy Pelosi, but we just could not get all the fine details written. And now they'll be submitting that it'll be a tentative agreement, a draft to Congress sometime by, I'll say, likely early next month, or early to middle next month. That they call it a draft because it's like a trial balloon. We get a chance 30 days to weigh in on this, and if we weigh in on it in a way that they can change the language, then they will try to do that and accommodate the disagreements along the way. But after that 30 days is up, then they submit the final draft, which is a 90-day, then there's 90 days for Congress to approve it up or down. That's what essentially what that trade agreement comes down to. So I'm glad to have the deadlines. Congress has to have deadlines apparently to get anything done. And it would seem that we could get to a place where we could have a USMCA agreement finalized. Maybe, I'll say the best timing would be 4 months or a little better from now. And I don't think it's going to come to the floor before the 90-day time is up. That's how the pattern has been in Nancy Pelosi when she held the gavel before. So that's, but I'm encouraged that we eventually get there. Sooner is better. I'd go there tomorrow if I could. I want it done. And then with China, that's the biggest and the most difficult one. The center of it has always been the theft of U.S. intellectual property by the Chinese. It'd be trademarks and copyrights and patents that they have made a national industry out of stealing the ideas and the creativity of America. I went over there to, I'll put that word in air quotes, negotiate with the Chinese to try to convince them to stop stealing our intellectual property. I set up a five-city tour, and the first city, diplomatic seating, they had a script. I didn't recognize it as a script, but I listened to every word of it, made my remarks, and tried to convince them to stop stealing our IP. Went to the next city, it was verbatim. Went to the third city, which was Beijing, and about a third of the way through, I could see it was verbatim. So I wasn't going to learn anything listening to that again. So I leaned back in my chair, then it was my BlackBerry, and I typed up a bill draft request, and it says, draft a bill that directs the U.S. Trade Representative to conduct a study to determine the value of U.S. intellectual property that is pirated by the Chinese and apply a duty to all products coming from China in amount equivalent to recover that loss and then distribute the proceeds to the rightful intellectual property rights holders. So I hit send on that request, and pretty sure the Chinese had that hacked before it ever got back to my office. But we wrote that bill, and I started pushing it. I got something like 60 signatures on it, and then Hollywood pushed back, Nashville pushed back, and I don't really know why, because they're stealing the movies and they're stealing the songs right along with all the other stuff we know about. But it just put the brakes on it. But I kept it out front. I went in and talked to the president about it a while back, like a few months ago now, and he liked the idea. I'd already talked to Larry Kudlow and Peter Navarro on it. They're top two White House negotiators on trade. The president said, I want you to take that to Navarro and to Kudlow and ask them to incorporate that into our trade negotiations. So the bill may not show up as something passed on the floor of the House. It may not show up in the policy. But if it does, you heard it here. And that's one of the things we're trying to do to get this done. And if we can get an agreement, I don't think we can get the Chinese to stop cold turkey stealing our intellectual property. There's just too much industry involved in that. There's all kinds of tactics, and they've got a lot of people and money. But we can dial it down, and we can put it on a path to end it. And hopefully we can get that done out of a Chinese agreement. And if we can get that done, the rest goes fast. If that's the case, then you'll see soybeans going to China in large volume, and that would help us a lot. And whenever you create a larger demand for any commodity, it also lifts the other commodities up too. We kind of know how that works. So that's the most important trade. Now, I want to add one more thing in for optimism on trade, and that's Larry Kudlow, for example, sat down in a group of several members of Congress, and he told us this narrative that just had taken place the day before. Now, this is about 3 months ago. He said that maybe 4 months ago was when Paul Juncker, the lead on the European Union, he's been there a long time running that show. When he came to Washington to meet with President Trump, his number two, his name is Martin Selmayr, and Kudlow said, so I just asked him, get me Selmayr's cell phone number, and I called him up and said, come on over to the hotel and I'll buy you a Coke and we'll talk trade. Well, they did that. Sat down at a little table in the hotel and started to talk trade. Kudlow didn't propose this, but Selmayr brought it up. He said, we want to buy more beef from America, more liquefied natural gas, and more soybeans. And we're willing to waive regulations in order to do that. Well, liquefied natural gas, I don't think they have to waive any. So when he says that, I interpret that to mean growth hormones in beef and GMOs in soybeans. And we've had lots of trouble cracking into the European market. It's been a trade protection citadel for a long time. And I have leveraged them for a long time. This is the best opening that I have seen. And Kudlow said, it's not a trade deal, but it is an opening. And I think he characterized it right. I think he's thinking about it right. And the reason for it, is it that they finally got a soft heart and decided they want to let us into their markets? I don't think so. But it has more to do with Juncker concluding that the European Union is too Germany-centric, and he'd like to, this is my interpretation, drive a wedge to kind of weaken the influence of Germany, and he can do that by opening this up for ag trade and liquefied natural gas. I think we should really work to get that trade deal done. That opens up a whole continent of market that we've been more or less shut out of. So I add that. That's not showing up in the press anywhere. That's a side story that if things unfold, you kind of get an insight into how some of those good things can happen. And the president issued his first veto a little over a week ago on the wall. And you know that I have supported this wall for a long time. Sometime back in about 2005, I was hearing people say, we can't build a wall. It's too hard. It's 2,000 miles. We have mountains and deserts and rivers. And so I just thought, well, I'm a construction guy. It's not that hard. And so we put together a model of a wall and just be like 1x6 siding, cut into chunks about long, painted it gray like concrete, made a little 1x2 foundation in there, went down to the floor, set this up, and so here's what we do. We just bring a truck through with precast panels on them, pick them up, set them in this slot. That's all out there on YouTube. I don't know how many times that's been watched. And we still have that wall in my office, and it's probably 10 years old. So I showed him how to build that wall. It really is simple. And the president ran on it. And I'm glad that he ran on it. And I believe that he has a mandate from the American people. And so he said, I will build the wall. And I also said he was going to make Mexico pay for it. That's a little harder. But I'm not stuck on that. I want the wall, and it'll pay for itself. And so I think we needed to help the president get that done. When the president was elected in November 2016, Paul Ryan was our Speaker of the House. I set up a meeting with him, a one-on-one meeting. It was in his office, no staff. And I wanted to know what kind of commitment he would make to me on providing the resources that we could build that, get that wall built to support the president's mandate. And after about a 30-minute meeting or a little more, I suppose, we concluded the meeting by saying, well, I believe that the president deserves and needs to have the resources necessary to secure the border. Now, that was in the context of the wall discussion. I walked out of there believing that this was his commitment, that we would fund the wall. And then we saw the redefinition of resources to secure the border. It could be more boots on the ground, it could be drones, it could be balloons, it could be sensors. But it turned out a bunch of them didn't want concrete wall. I still think that's the best structure we can have. But what happened was, I think Republican leadership slow-walked the funding for the wall. And that's why the president got down to the last option here, which is went through the government shutdown. I said to the president in September of last year, we need to have the showdown by the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. And if that brings about a shutdown, then the voters can decide in November which side of this thing they want to be on. He was convinced by, I believe, Paul Ryan, that the funding would be there on December 7th, which is when that CR was extended to. And we all know how that didn't work out. So the president got down to his last option, is what I'm just building up and telling you. And he has the legal authority to declare an emergency and use the funds that are already appropriated to secure our border and build the wall. That's a statute that was created in 1976, and it's one that's been used 50 times by other presidents. And so he has the constitutional authority, he has the law on his side, the statutory authority, and he'll be sued and litigated. Like every movie when he makes, he gets sued by people on the other side. So I said, okay, just trudge through there, let's build the wall, and let's get her done. I think he's going to have about $8 billion, which is a pretty good start on this. And so that's the wall situation. There's going to be a veto override attempt come up in Congress, I believe, next week, and I'll be standing with the president on that veto override attempt, and I think we'll be able to deny the override. It takes a 2/3 majority, and I don't think they'll be able to generate the votes to override the president's veto in the House or the Senate, although I'm disappointed with about a dozen Republican senators. Then just a couple words about the Green New Deal. That's been a pretty big deal, and Nancy Pelosi called it the Green Dream. And you know, I looked at the global warming situation, which now has to get renamed to be climate change. There's always been climate change. It's a pretty handy little title to have. Now you can blame everything on that. But what made me suspicious in the first place was I heard all these bad things about global warming, and I started to read these articles looking for what are the good things, because you know, I spent a lot of my life cold, and you know, spent much of my life trying to get warm. So a little warmer didn't scare me very much. There must be something good about that. And if you look at some of the good things, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, there's more photosynthesis. If the earth is warmer, then around this country, you lose about 1/4 inch of water off of any surface in July. That goes into the atmosphere. According to Newton's first law of physics, what goes up must come down. So that means to me that it'll rain more and more places, and we'll have a little bit warmer planet. If they're right, that means there'll be more photosynthesis. That means more crops, more growth, more sequestered carbon. So there must be something good on this, but they couldn't find anything. So I got fairly suspicious on that. I brought a number of different scientists in, ahead of his speakers, brought some members together, and I'm just this guy that says that. I'm a skeptic, but I do think we need to have clean air, we need to have clean water, and we need to manage it in our new construction, in our reconstruction. Well, let's make sure that we've got it well insulated, that it's energy efficient, and we are the center of the renewable energy, which is all renewable, or we're the center of all of the biofuels we have, the renewable energy. And this is the #1 renewable energy producing congressional district in all of America. We are sometimes knocking on the door being #1 in ethanol production. Sometimes those vast open spaces that are 2/3 of Nebraska beat us in that. But as biodiesel production, we're #1. And on wind generation, we set 2nd or 3rd. When you add all that together, ethanol, biodiesel, and wind, we produce more BTUs of renewable energy than any other congressional district in America. And we have the knowledge base here on top of it. And that knowledge base, as the years go by, becomes more valuable to us because we can market our knowledge and the industry that we build here to the rest of the country and the world. That's all really good stuff. I can go deeper into that, but I just think there's good things that we can do that don't sacrifice American competitiveness over to India or China, and that's what the Green New Deal looks to me like it does, along with a number of other things that are. Then the #1 bill that came out was H.R. 1, and that rewrites our election laws. I opposed it. I don't think we ought to federalize them. I don't think we ought to be subsidizing political races. It says in there if you can raise $1 from an individual, or maybe it's even a constituent, future constituent potentially, Bruce produces $6 worth of taxpayer dollars to go into your campaign account. So that's like compelling you to fund a candidate that you might be preparing to vote against. You could have donated $6 to one candidate, and they pick up $1, and there goes $6 in out of your tax dollars to fund the opposition. I think that's an idea we're not ready for. Speaking of sixes, voting age at 16. I started reading the Twitter. There was a stream in there of all the things that people did when they were 16. And once I got down through that a ways, it was pretty clear they're not ready at 16 to vote and decide who the next leader of the free world is going to be. But folks on the other side of the aisle, they want 16-year-olds to vote, they want felons to vote, and they want illegal aliens to vote. And those are all things that I oppose. And I think that we need to have integrity, And I always have wanted, and I wrote legislation when I was in the state for a voter registration list that was free of duplicates, deceased, and felons, that they sort of be certified to be citizens of the United States, and and they require a picture ID and a paper ballot trail. I wrote that back in 2001, and we got some of that done. And I think that Paul Pate did a terrific job with that. He was very serious and consulted with me on it. He actually would have done fine without my help, and so I'm pleased with that the case. So that's the things I had on my note. Maybe here's another couple pages. E15, I better mention that. We finally there with a rule proposed that supports going to E15 year-round, and that helps us a lot. We had been working that for a long time. A lot of our commodities groups were doing a terrific job of that, and I went in to talk with the president about that. The number of things I wanted to talk to him about, I wrote them on my hand, and kind of like Sarah Palin. But when you go in and talk to the president, you can't say to him, "Oh, just a minute, I'm going to consult my note. Oh, here, let me read this to you." It's a much faster paced conversation than that. And it was supposed to be 30 minutes, and it turned into 75. So I didn't get everything brought up I wanted to talk about. That was my fault. I think I did, though. But it's very fast moving. His curiosity takes you places. It'll surprise you. He puts you on the spot sometimes, not because necessarily of what he might believe, but he wants to find out how deeply you believe something. It's a bit of a curious way on how he does this. But we went through all this, and about 20 minutes in, about 10 minutes in probably, I knew E15 was going to be okay, and reinforced that. 2 days later, he announced we're going to year-round E15. So I was one of the last people to talk to him about that topic, and I was glad to have that chance to push that in. And then I went to see Administrator Wheeler. He's, of course, the fellow that replaced Scott Pruitt, who was leaning strongly over to the side of petroleum, and that was very frustrating. When I talked to Administrator Wheeler, I never walked away from that conversation thinking that I actually got any commitment from one side or the other. He's a guy that can listen to you, he can talk to you, and his conversation, when he's done, the response is utterly neutral. And okay, did it make any difference or didn't I? I'll never know. But the rules that are written, he did tell me he didn't think they would be able to produce the rules until late in May. Well, the rules are out now as of about a week ago. So they got it done faster than he indicated to me. I'm happy to see that. So I'm cheering about having at least rules to digest and comment on and being ready for a year-round E15 when the weather warms up in June. Then 2 days after the rules come out, then we see that he's granted 5 more small refinery waivers, RIN waivers. And those RIN waivers just take away RFS market. That's just essentially what they do. So now we're up to at least 1.7 billion gallons that are RFS gallons that have been nullified by RIN waivers. So I just sent out a tweet that said it looks like there was an offset that was part of the deal. We're gonna get the rule for E15, and then Administrator Wheeler then hands out 5 more sets of RIN waivers for the 5 small refineries, and that's frustrating to me. I'm going to keep pounding on that, and I know he got the message back from me. So, I think maybe that's African swine fever. That's the only other thing I might. 1 million pounds of pork was intercepted at Newark Port here about a week ago that is smuggled in from an African swine fever country, China, in all kinds of containers that you would never guess there was meat in at all. And that violates our prohibition on any of that meat coming in from a country that has African swine fever. My people tell me the only defense we have is to keep it out of here. If it hits us, it's a huge problem. So we caught 1 million pounds of it, but did we get it all? I'd be surprised if we got it all, and I'm very uneasy about that. But there's much other things we can talk about. I've been trying to stretch this monologue out long enough that Colby would be ready, sorting through the questions. So turning it over to you, Colby, to initiate the questions.
Sounds good. Our first question is going to come from Cecil Blum, and it's about the loss of the committee assignments. Cecil, where are you at? Oh, front row right here.
Well, I think my own personal opinion, I think my own personal opinion is that with you being removed of your committee assignments, some people are starting kind of a secondary never kinger group. And I think that they feel that without you being able to represent Iowa in the committees, I think that they feel you're going to be very ineffective for the 4th district. And I guess that's the basis of this question.
Okay, well, thanks, Cecil. First, if there ever was going to be a time not to have committees, it would be the time with Nancy Pelosi as the speaker and all of her hand-picked committee chairs. None of our legislation is going to move through any of those committees. The role as a minority in a committee, especially in a time like this, is strictly playing defense. Now, I'm actually, I think, fairly good at that, and I think they will miss that, especially on the Judiciary Committee. And I don't want to diminish it. There's leverage that's lost there. And I've said that I'm going to do my best to multiply that in other areas. I can't tell you today whether I can make that more leverage, but I can tell you I'm looking and doing hopefully some creative things to make that happen. Second thing is we have a broad effort to get the committee assignments restored. I think Kevin McCarthy made a knee-jerk decision. He did not have the benefit of the facts that he now should have the benefit of. And I produced a 6-page fact document that I posted up on Twitter. And if anybody wants that, we don't have printed copies here, but we can get you the link that you can open up and read it. The basis of it is this. I'm misquoted by the New York Times. And all evidence out there supports me on this, that it was a phone call that I received from a reporter. He said that he was assigned by his editor to write I'll call it a feature story, although I'm not sure he used that word, that it told the narrative on how it is that Donald Trump's immigration policy is the immigration policy that I've advocated clear back, as far back as the time I was elected to Congress the first time in 2002. I took the bait on that, and I confess that it was a mistake to do that interview. But we did get the story, the feature story that laid that out. I told the president one day, he made a statement, he said, I raised more money there was 5 or so members sitting around the huddle in the Oval Office, and he said, I raised more money for Steve King, he's telling them this, I raised more money for Steve King than anybody else ever did. And that's fine, and I appreciate that, and I really do. And I said, well, Mr. President, yes, but I market tested your immigration policy for you for 14 years. That ought to be worth something. And so we had a nice laugh out about that, but that's essentially what the New York Times story was to be about, kind of was, except for 4 words injected in there. This was a 56-minute interview by phone, no tape anywhere, my end or his end. I couldn't, and he didn't. And he was typing as I was talking twice. I could hear the keys punching. So I know from that if you don't hear the keys punching and you want them to quote you, if they're not typing, they're not quoting you. And I remember that process going through my mind. And I remember also twice he asked me to repeat a sentence because he wanted to get the quote right. Well, that wasn't the one that came in that caused the controversy that he asked me to repeat. And he won't tell us what the question even was that he asked me. For me, it's not clear enough for me to say, well, he said this, and I said precisely that. We're really talking as much about punctuation as we are about words themselves. But it's this, that New York Times quote ties together 3 different terms: white nationalism, white supremacy, Western civilization. And so we signed up for LexisNexis, and that's the network that goes back and it scours everything that's in print, and if there's anything that was in radio or TV that was reduced to print also, it scours all of that, all the websites and everything. And so we asked the question, have I ever been quoted using the term white nationalism or white supremacy or any derivative thereof, back to the year 2000 and up to the January 10th New York Times article? Never. I had never been quoted ever even uttering those words. And then, so we asked the question by comparison. I did say Western civilization. I defend Western civilization. It's the essential umbrella value for all of us here in this country, and it's the foundation that built America. And so we checked that from the year 2000 up until January 10th, ever quoted as saying Western civilization? Yeah, 276 times. So there's your ratio. Was the New York Times right? They scored 0 and 0. I said Western civilization, I scored 276. So that's how you can figure your probability on who's right and who's wrong. But regardless, Kevin McCarthy sided with the New York Times reporter. And he told me that he believes him. Well, I don't know how he could say he doesn't believe me. And there's not a soul in that Congress that can ever stand up and say they've gotten anything out of me but the truth or a mistake. And that's important to know the difference. If somebody makes a mistake, it's not a lie, it's a mistake. But if they know it's wrong and they repeat it, it's a lie. And if you remember, Charlton Heston had to remind us of that back during the Clinton years. But there's no one there that works with me that's ever challenged my honesty. And furthermore, this is all about calling Steve King a racist to try to diminish my leverage in Congress. Of all the people I've worked with there, 435 members of Congress, all of their staff that I interact with, and it's not all of them, but all of them, people come and they go. And you know, there's not a single accuser, not one individual that would stand up and say that Steve King has ever discriminated against them or treated them in a disrespectful fashion, regardless of whatever their race, ethnicity, or national origin was. And remember, Brett Kavanaugh had about 6 accusers. I think all of them didn't hold up very well, but at least he had accusers. I don't have any accusers. I've just got a New York Times story that is a misquote that's definitively proven, I think, to be a misquote. So I don't know how Kevin McCarthy holds his ground on this once this knowledge penetrates through and gets to enough of the members that are there. By the way, we have a coalition of black pastors who volunteered to come forward, and they've taken a stand to defend me. Reverend Bill Owens, who is the lead in the Black Pastors of America, brought a group together. We had a meeting here a little over a week ago, and he's out now bringing more people in. And I wondered, why would they come forward? I mean, what do they owe me? Nothing. But they've been through it, I learned. They have been tested more than I've been tested, and they understand the injustice, and Bill Owens and others want to fix that. And Diamond and Silk, they came on real early. They've been friends for a long time. They did a program or two on this, and I don't know, maybe I'll ask them to come to Iowa. I think they'd sell pretty well in this place. But they're just a lot of fun, and also Sheriff David Clark and David Webb and multiple other people that you'll recognize, I think, as national names. So that's where we are. I intend to do all legitimate things to get those committee assignments back, and when that happens, then I think it just restores the credibility to this, and Iowans can take a deep breath and go, you know what, we had a leader that made a knee-jerk decision, and now I have to give him a smooth way to get out of it too. I can't put him in a corner, give him a smooth way, hopefully, and that means give him lots of logical reasons and a lot of members that will stand with me, and they're doing that. Thanks, Cecil.
Thank you.
Our second question is from Keith Zedeca. It's about healthcare, and our next question after that will come from Sally.
I live in Monona County. We're one of the older populated counties and one of the smaller population ones also. We have this issue with county jails being overloaded all the time, so we're thinking about building a new jail, doubling the size of it. One problem we have is when these inmates come in with health care problems, we're stuck with all their meds, all their hospital bills, everything. We've had somebody come in here had a heart attack, cost the county thousands of dollars to take care of that inmate. And what happens if maybe they're on Title 19, they also got their own health care, how come does that discontinue, you know, paying their meds or their hospital care or whatever? Is that a federal or state issue? I don't know. But anyway, on small counties like ours, it's a real burden to pay that bill all the time. So, what might be the answer?
It is, I think I heard you say that if they're, say, on Title 19, when they go to jail, that gets dropped off and the bill goes to jail. I didn't know that. I've not at least heard that I recall. So I want to look in on that and see what it is. And Colby's got a note. And I also tell you that this is, I should have said at the beginning, this is on Facebook Live. So our staff is sitting out there in Washington watching this right now. So it's an instantaneous request. And I'll just say, Sue Ann will look into this. And we've got your name. And we'll get an answer back to you on how that might be, that rationale, that provision might be. I think you're right in the at least the philosophy that you express. It also, what you're telling me, this narrative makes me think of a case. I won't name the county here, but I know exactly which one it was. They pulled 2 illegals over that had 28 pounds of marijuana in the car. And so they arrested them, confiscated the drugs. That was all good. Put them in jail, in the county jail. And one of them started, after, I don't know, some hours or so, began to have these pains in his stomach. And so they thought, we send him out to the hospital, the taxpayers have to pay for all the medical expenses that go on. And amazingly, they turned him loose, and that seemed to be what cured that pain. So I get really uneasy about those things when we're making economic decisions about enforcing the law. That's not here in this county, and it's not in Monona either. It's multiple counties away, but that's part of the equation for me too. If the federal government's got, say, a Title 19, then we ought to be sticking with them through their incarceration too. That shouldn't change that. But we'll find out. Colby's got that down, and I'm sure Sue Ann's heard that out in Washington by now. But inefficiency we didn't know we had. Just stumbled into the Facebook efficiency. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You don't have any water in your county? No?
No, not in we're in the hills, over on the western side they did.
Bottoms are
Yes.
full now? Any fuller than they were in 2011?
Probably worse in some places, but not the sand that we had in 2011, had all that sand over there.
That was, I'll never forget that. So I'll get a better look at some of that later on today. Thanks. Thanks for the report. Who's up next?
Our third question comes from Sally about illegal immigration, and then after that, we'll have a question from Rick Staley.
Yeah. I just heard on TV that they're bus loading, the cartels, buses of illegals and to cross over and overwhelming our system, and that they caught a lot just recently, yesterday or so, and they have to release them into the system because they don't have any more facilities to hold them. And I have seen on TV that when they did catch a group and they come in, that they've got smiles on their face because they know that they're in here free and clear. And our government is not doing anything to change the immigration law to stop this and overwhelming. And then we get to pay for their health care and their food and housing and all that. And they're stealing our Social Security. And the government, the IRS knows about that, and they're not doing anything about that. They say, let it go. And that hurts the citizens of the United States with identity theft. So why is the government not working on trying to reform the immigration law and stop this?
Well, this is a big problem, and it's gotten exponentially worse here over the last year or so. We saw the illegal crossings when Donald Trump became president went down dramatically, and the administration was proud about that, and I was glad to see that data. But once they found out that there wasn't teeth, then they accelerated, and I believe the cartels are utilizing families because of the holes in our immigration law. One of them is the requirement for asylum. It's too loose and it's too easy to comply with. But I had a meeting with Francis Cisneros, and he's the director for U.S. Center for Immigration Services. They're the ones that issue the visas and make all this stuff happen. I wanted to just look in here and make sure that I got the spelling right. I don't have it in here. Okay. Anyway, but here's some of the numbers on asylum. The asylum applicants. I've stood there and watched them come across the river in a john boat I can think of one in particular. It was two coyotes in a John boat, and we watched them from Roma, Texas, up on above a cliff, look across the other side where kind of a sandbar comes down, and they drove around through that parking lot, around, and at about 3:45, they parked their car and got out of the trunk an inflatable raft, and they had like one of those pumps like that. They pumped up the inflatable raft, and they take it down, put it in the water, and they brought a pregnant lady in there. She looked like she was maybe, I'm guessing 7 months along or so. She had two little bags of her possessions, and they take that raft across the river. It's right at the shift change of the Border Patrol. She gets out of the raft, stands in the weeds and waits for the next shift of the Border Patrol to come, and then the rest I have to assume, but applies for asylum. And 2 months later, there's a new American citizen there that came along with her. That pattern has now just grown. And some of the very sad things that are going on, for example, there's been a lot of publicity about the two children that died in ICE custody. And that is very unfortunate. If you look back on the track of them, it looked like they did all they could to save those children, and they were put at great risk by a parent. But when Kirsten Nielsen was before the Judiciary Committee last December under oath, and she was being criticized for the two deaths in American custody, I asked her how many die on the way to our southern border, say coming out of El Salvador, Guatemala, down in there, 1,500 miles roughly from there to McAllen. And she said, well, I don't know, I'll get that information for you. And I said, no, Madam Secretary, I want your best estimate right now, because we know what happens when you issue a report. Nobody ever sees it again. So give me your judgment. And I pressed her 2 or 3 times, and surprisingly, she gave me an answer. She said, how many died on the way to our southern border? Her answer under oath, that never hit the press, thousands and thousands. That's how bad that is. And nearly every one of the females coming up from there, the young girls, get birth control before they go. And it's not a prescription item down in, say, Guatemala City. And I talked to the ambassador from Guatemala, and I asked him point blank questions. He's a good guy, by the way. And I learned in that discussion, there are people down there that are mortgaging their homes to pay the coyotes to ship their families up here. And they know that once they get across the border, they're going to get to stay. Asylum applications, that discussion with the director of USCIS, and it's actually Francis Cisna, rather than Cisneros, Cisna. And he was with the Obama administration and now with Trump. And I think he's a straight shooter and a rule of law guy and a non-political individual. But he said, once they come, they apply for asylum, then they get a court date, and they're released to return, and it's without bond. He said about 60% of them don't show up. And then the rest do. That was a higher number than I thought that shows up. And then once you break those numbers all down, there are only about 6% of them that actually qualify for asylum. And the rest of them that have been denied, they turn them loose without bond and give them a court date to come back to be told when they're going to be deported. Well, they don't show up. So what it amounts to is of 100% of them, this is theoretically, so you say virtually, 100% of them that come in and declare asylum get to stay in America. 6% will receive the asylum, they'll receive a legal status, and the other 94% stay in America illegally because there's no bond, and then the only ones that get deported out of that are those that ICE accidentally comes across that might be sent back home. That's a huge magnet. Then there's a story that we put kids in cages. I had a couple of visitors yesterday that just insist that that's what our administration is doing. I've been down there and watched that. In McAllen, for example, they took a huge warehouse and in 17 days retrofitted that with central air and divided it out with chain link fence so that they can keep girls of a certain age here, here, and here, boys of a certain age here, here, and here. It's pretty necessary in a place like that. They all had I thought, a comfortable place to sleep. They all went through a medical checkup by a nurse with a doctor for a backup if they needed to be seen by a doctor. They got a shower, they got a fresh change of clothes, they get 3 squares a day. And when I was there, we had coaches hired, and they were playing soccer in the air conditioning. And my kids never got to do that. So I didn't see abuse, and I don't believe that there were any of these kids in cages, but if I'd taken pictures of them through the chain link, it would have looked like it. And that's what I think we have down there. There's a court case called the Flores decision that says we can only hold them for 20 days, and then we've got to turn them loose. So this is our federal court intervening with policy. We could fix that by an act of Congress, but you know that's not going to happen under this situation that we have now. I introduced that with regard to the Social Security and administration needing to cooperate with DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and also with the IRS. I brought legislation called the New IDEA Act. What it does is it clarifies that wages and benefits paid to illegals are not tax deductible for federal income tax purposes. Then when the IRS shows up to do a normal audit, not accelerated, but a normal audit as they would, then they run the employees' names and identifiers all through E-Verify. If they qualify, the employer gets safe harbor or using E-Verify, but otherwise he gets 72 hours to cure, is the language we use, if there happens to be a mistake or something. Otherwise, the IRS will say, sorry, you can't deduct the wages that are paid to this illegal individual, illegal alien, and so now those wages that were written off as a business expense go back into the gross receipts and they show up as taxable income, and it turns your $10 an hour illegal into about a $16 an hour illegal, and it has a 6-year statute of limitations, and it requires the Social Security Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and the IRS to set up a working cooperative team to focus their resources on enforcing immigration law. I can't get that passed either, even before the gavel changed over to the new majority. But there's powerful political forces on this, and the growth in politics and the leverage in politics that comes for the people on the left is growing exponentially as well. And then you've got employers on both sides of either party that are huge beneficiaries of cheap labor, and they lobby hard for that. And it's just the frustration of trying to deal with that and restore the respect for the rule of law. We've got millions of illegals in America. When I first went there, well, they thought there was about 1 million in 1986, and Ronald Reagan signed the Amnesty Act, and 3 million were the beneficiaries of it. Others were still here, and the number grew, and after a little while, there were 10 million illegals. When I went to Congress, it was 11, or then it got to 12, and for 10 years, they sat on 11 million. And how can it be that we've got as many as 3 million successful border crossing attempts, and the number doesn't change? 3 million a year, and the number doesn't change. Finally, they reassessed it. MIT did some research. They came out with a number of 22 million, plus or minus about 2. That number could still be a low ball, but it's huge political and economic power, and the more that grows, the less chance we have to restore the rule of law. You're troubled, I'm troubled, there's good reason to be, and it's harder to solve now than it was, I'll say, 5 or 10 years ago. We didn't have the leadership then, and Trump is leading, but now the leverage is against him. And I think Republicans let him down, Republican leadership let him down, and the other folks on the other side, they're the beneficiaries, they're not going to help us. Hope that, I know that didn't cheer you up. It doesn't cheer me up even thinking about it, but I think it's an honest, objective answer to the topic you brought up.
So there's nothing we can do about it?
I think we need to make all the noise we can make. And I think the president needs to have support always on this. He's got the right instincts, and he's got the most leverage, of course, of anybody. And that's why I'm working more with the executive branch of government. Chances of getting bills passed right now are not so good, but my leverage to have those conversations and move those things it's all there. You know, that's another thing is that everything one does in Congress doesn't go through a committee that you're seated on. For example, last October 19th, we cut the ribbon on 4-lane Highway 20. That was my #1 transportation priority when I was elected to Congress. I told everybody that, and cutting that ribbon on that day, lots of people did good work on that, and I don't want to diminish any of that. I want to applaud it. But I put in an earmark back when we had earmarks that could only be used west of 71 on 4-lane Highway 20, and when I did that, they could only use that money to buy right-of-way and do engineering and archaeological. So when the money actually came from that gas tax piece that the state legislature passed, this project was shovel-ready from 71 west to Sioux City. And having it shovel-ready allowed it to be in the front of the priority list instead of kicked back in the priority list. So we would eventually be cutting that ribbon someday on 4-lane Highway 20, whether I'm involved or not. But I worked on it at least 25 years, and I know it would not have been cut yet if it hadn't been for that earmark, because that made it shovel-ready. So that's one of the things. I'm not on that committee, but it's one of the things that got done because of paying attention to your needs, listening to you, and you put drive in me. Sometimes you can walk away from a conversation, sometimes you need to get right into the middle of it. And when I hear from you, that gives me the inspiration to push harder at those opportunities. I'll do more on immigration because of our conversation.
All right.
Thank you.
We only have about 5 minutes left, so we'll just got
We're going to run over that today, aren't we?
So the next question is from Rick Staley about the rising cost of healthcare premiums.
Steve, I was visiting with my brother yesterday, and he's 61 years old. His wife is, I believe, 58, and his health care premiums right now are around $2,500 a month. And they're a farmer, and it's just, he's fortunate he's a farmer in some ways, but unfortunately he doesn't have a group plan to be in. And he's real concerned about that and how other people are not having health care. What is DC doing for us out here? What are we doing? What's on the docket for health care right now?
Well, Rick, that's one of the saddest circumstances that we have. And you'll know how hard I tried to beat that and defeat it and repeal it. We made some strategic mistakes on that. I wanted just to cleanly repeal it, shut off all the funding to implement or enforce it. That legislation did pass the House, I don't know how many times, it never passed the Senate in an effective way. It was a one-vote decision that had us on the cusp of some of that repeal. But the result of this came down, there are, I believe it's 12 essential health care benefits that are written into Obamacare that have to be in every policy. And I don't want any of them, because we can't, then what we can't do is we can't offer policies that are high deductible and high copayment that let somebody, especially that's self-employed, that calculates out to be $30,000 a year in premium. Now imagine that, reaching into having to go out and it's probably after tax dollars is going to be my guess. I also brought legislation we had a reasonable chance to get passed, and it fell a little short, that provided for 100% deductibility of everybody's health insurance premiums. That would help. At least you could pay for it with before tax dollars instead of after. There turned out to be 20.9 million people in the country that are trapped in that buying insurance with after-tax dollars while they're competing with people that buy it with before-tax dollars. So those, I can give you solutions, but I can't give you a promise we can get them done. Because now we have a majority in the House that they're the people that passed Obamacare in the first place. They're not going to cooperate with anything that dismantles it or takes it away. I also introduced legislation, and it's introduced now, but in the past couple, 3 Congresses, that expand HSAs, so that we did the math on this some years ago, where if you maxed out into your HSA, your health savings account, you take imagine a young couple at age 20, and you could put $5,150 in there, and then it increased with inflation each year. We took out $2,000 a year in real health care costs. By the time they reached Medicare eligibility, they would have $950,000 in that health savings account. And then if we'd say to them, why don't you go buy a Medicare replacement policy, paid up for life, annuitized, and take yourself off the entitlement rolls, and in exchange we'll let you keep the change in your health savings account, they'd walk away with $800,000 in there, just putting them the max in at those numbers. We increased those numbers and set up all those promises in a piece of legislation that's not going to go anywhere. The ideas are there, and I'm not the only one with ideas at all. Paul Gosar of Arizona has pushed hard for selling insurance across state lines, and that would make a big difference if we could, when Obamacare passed, the typical health insurance policy for a 23-year-old healthy male from New Jersey was $6,000 a year. That same young man, if he were in Kentucky, would be paying $1,000 a year. Policies may not be equal or even equivalent, but those were typical premiums. So why wouldn't you let that young man in New Jersey buy a policy out of Kentucky? And I know that the healthcare costs in New Jersey would be a little higher, and the premium may not be $1,000, but still gave those kind of options. I want people to be able to buy in their insurance that's demanded by the marketplace and the consumers a la carte. And we had those ideas out there, we had the bills out there, we just couldn't get the votes put together to do it. Now, it's an unknown territory, and with the individual mandate being, I'll say, peeled out of there with the tax bill we did a year ago December, that's a good thing, that helps people, but it still doesn't solve the insurance problem. It just takes some people off the hook of mandatorily having to buy it. I wish I had a better answer for you, Rick. It's a tough spot, and Medicare's right around the corner if you're 61. I'm sure that's what they're thinking. I hate to promise that as a solution, and we'll pray for their good health, and maybe we'll get enough pressure in Washington that we can actually fix that. I've lived through a lot of years of frustration on that one myself, and a few more will be okay. I'm willing to do it. Thanks.
So we're into overtime here, but we had a really good virtually submitted question from a citizen of Charter Oak. Lauren Strait asks, what is the Republican plan to reduce the national debt?
I didn't pick Lauren out. I want to look you in the eye when I give you this answer. Right around here anywhere, right where you
Look into the Facebook Live camera. Though.
What's that?
Yep, it was virtual, so into the Facebook
Oh, it was
Live
virtual?
camera. Yes,
Really?
from Charter Oak resident though.
Okay, I didn't get that one. So, all right, I'll look into the camera then, Lauren. The national debt. That is, it's going to sound facetious if I say a growing problem, but it is a growing problem. We're looking at $22 trillion being rung up here in national debt. And I have long been for a balanced budget for our Constitution to require a constitutional amendment to get to a balanced budget. When I went to Congress, Jim Nussel, our fine Iowa fellow, chairman of the Budget Committee, and the first non-balancing budget was offered in that year of 2003. And I went to him and said, where's our balanced budget? And he said, we can't balance the budget. We're in war, Afghanistan, we're preparing to go to war in Iraq, we have to set up TSA, all the things that happened September 11, 2001 were coming at us. And I said, we need to balance, we need to tighten our belts regardless, because we didn't work our way through this. Otherwise, if we lose the balance, getting back to balance is hard. Well, it's appeared to be nearly impossible. We haven't balanced the budget since then. And I look at my sons, they're, by the time they put in 40 or 45 years of work, it looks to me like they're going to have worked all of their careers and never seen the federal government balance its budget. That's how bad this is. And we brought a couple of constitutional amendments to balance the budget a few years ago. We came short of getting them passed on the floor of the House. It was, however, a sincere effort. And but last summer, we had a balanced budget amendment come to the floor that failed miserably, but it was not a sincere effort. It was just an effort, a decision made on the part of leadership to be able to say we voted on a balanced budget and we couldn't pass it. That's my analysis of it. I can tell you more details of it, Lauren. But so and then I went in to the West Wing when it'd be about April of 2017 when the Trump administration was getting set up. And at that time, Steve Bannon was the chief advisor for the president. And I went into his war room. He has a big whiteboard up there on the wall. And on it was all of President Trump's his promises. And he'd already kept some of them with his executive decisions on rules and whatnot. So there were check marks behind those accomplished. And I looked at that, and I don't remember, I'd have to check the picture, but I don't remember seeing balanced budget being on that list. But I brought it up. And I said, how do we get to balance? And the answer that I got was, we've been talking about this, we want to get to balance, but we don't think we can get there in the first Trump term. We have to get the economy growing, and in a second term, we think we've got a shot at it to get it balanced, and that's kind of the dedication that I took it that they were dedicated to that. We do have some pretty good and healthy economic growth, although the numbers that came out in the last couple of days dial down our expectations to about 2.1 GDP growth. I don't think we get there unless we have 3% or better, but growing the economy is a big piece of it, and having the discipline to cut our budget is another piece. And I do have that discipline. I've demonstrated that over and over again. But I'm not very optimistic about getting to balance in the next 2 years. And I think we're going to need to hear a lot from the American people to build enough pressure. I spent about a 2.5-hour meeting yesterday with some people that are pushing for a convention of the states to bring constitutional amendments forward, a convention of the states. I have some reservations about that, but I said to them, I'm not about discouraging open dialogue. And if you want to bring this, you got every constitutional right to do that. And I encourage the debate. One of the components they want to do is a balanced budget amendment too. So on all these forces, I'm not optimistic, but there's some things at play that could bring us to that. And it's not in the short term for sure, but maybe 2 years from now it'll look better, and I hope it does. Sorry, Lauren, that's not a very happy answer.
Yep. So the worst and often hardest part of my job is clock enforcement. So any closing comments from you?
Well, if there, I want to make sure there's no burning question that people are going to look at and think they didn't ask it because they didn't want to answer. Because I'm happy to answer everything, and so.
We did have a good question from Dennis McCodless about what about the TPP? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, where are you, Dennis? All right, good. Yeah, I know you are now. Yeah, Trans-Pacific Partnership. I was sitting in the convention in Cleveland in the summer of 2016 when Donald Trump gave his speech on that Thursday night, his acceptance speech. And when he said, I'm gonna end the TPP, 2/3 of that convention roared in approval. I was sitting next to Linda Upmeyer, the Speaker of our Iowa House. She's a good gal, by the way. And I leaned over to Linda and I said, TPP is dead. Hillary Clinton was against TPP. Donald Trump was against it. It was certain that we weren't going to elect a president that was going to let that happen. And that part's been true. Let's see. There's a piece of legislation that set the stage for that I got some pretty good amendments in. And I don't remember the acronym on it now. But what we are doing is negotiating with some of those countries. And I'd like to see us put it together and, like, if we can't do a broad agreement, let's take the pieces of that country bilateral agreements and put them together in like a trade jigsaw puzzle that gives us something close to the TPP. That's all I can say with that. And actually, I don't think much of anything happens until we get through the China agreement and the USMCA. Thanks for asking.
My question, would the TPP be
Oh.
a nice way of putting pressure on China? Since we're in China negotiations anyway, I would have thought that would have been a good way to pressure the Chinese even more.
I agree with you. I supported it, and I still do, but it's not going to get through these trade negotiators we have, and it's just. And another role I didn't say to this is that when the president decided he was going to renegotiate NAFTA, I didn't come out against that decision. It was already made. Instead, I pushed that information in behind the scenes, and I talked to him about that because I don't want to weaken the president's hand. I want to get the best deal we can get. That's all of those agreements. But I agree with you on what TPP could have been used to do, and we thought it was being used for that. Now we're in a different place. Yeah, so.
One real quick one, just another question I had there was about the never Trumpers that we have that are supposedly Republicans. Is there some way we get their names off bites? We gotta get rid of them. Because
I can name a few of them right here. You know, who are the lead never Trumpers in America? Well, I have to put Bill Kristol's on that list.
yeah,
I mean, he's just, he can't stop himself. Every opportunity to hammer the president. Looks like maybe George Conaway is not a big fan of the president these days.
you know, even in our own Congress, in our Senate.
How about Mitt Romney?
Yeah,
How about Jeb Bush?
Look what he did, look what the president did to help get him elected.
Yes.
You know, I mean, these people, I mean,
By the way, when this New York Times quote came down, who were the first people to come out and take a shot at me? Never Trumpers.
right.
And this has something to do with the Iowa First of the Nation caucuses. And there's a lot of enemies to our First of the Nation caucuses. They don't want the grassroots people to be making the decisions on who gets the first jump at the nomination. And they're going through a lot of motions to try to weaken that. I was not on Mitt Romney's side in 2008 or 2012, and he didn't succeed in either one of those cases in Iowa. Jeb Bush, $130 million spent, and he got less than 1% of the vote. And that was, of course, a big failure. So and I see how these people come together. Evan McMullen is another one. He ran for president in Utah, recruited by Bill Kristol for the very purpose of denying Trump the presidency by trying to claim the electors in Utah for Evan McMullen. McMullen recruited by Bill Kristol, McMullen being the guy that ran the PAC that beat up on me and Devin Nunes last election, called the American Futures PAC, and he would be one of the lead Never Trumpers too. I think we ought to flush them all out. And here's what I'd like. If you don't like, I'll just say to all of you, if you don't like Donald Trump for whatever reason, personal reasons or some of those things about his history that makes most of us a little uneasy from time to time, look at what he's doing. Look at the policy. Look at the promises that he made. Is he keeping those promises? The answer is yes. Is our economy in better shape? Are we more respected abroad? Depends on what your attitude is. How about militarily? Is he getting the things done that he said he was going to do? And I think the answer to that is yes across the board. So why don't we just get the policy done and forget about the personalities? That's where I am on this, and I learned to like him. So no more questions, Tosh?
Any closing comments before we wrap it up?
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for taking time out of your day for being here. Thanks to Charter Oak for the hospitality in this room that's pretty comfortable to me. I've been here a good number of times. And the exchange that we have today, it helps me go on to the next and the next, fills me up with the things I need to know, and it tells me about how you're thinking. And so if there's anything that we didn't answer, and there isn't, but please let us know. And I want to thank our staff for being here always to stand up, Jim and Wiltsey and Colby for being a good part of this. But happy to come back to Charter Oak anytime. We're in Crawford County. We're going to do 39 town hall meetings and at least, and it's going to be more than that. And most of them have been going very well. So thanks for your attention. Time you're here. Bless you all. Appreciate it.